The morning Melissa slid the divorce papers across the kitchen table, she was wearing her dress uniform. Every button polished. Every crease sharp. She looked at me the way she looked at recruits who'd failed inspection, with a particular kind of contempt that said she'd already made up her mind before the conversation started. "I've had my lawyer draw these up," she said, not sitting down, not even taking off her cover. "I need you to sign them today." I looked at the papers. Then I looked at her. 7 years. 7 years of marriage, and she was delivering this like a field order, standing at attention, ready to march out the door the moment the mission was complete. "Melissa, don't." She held up one hand. "I've thought about this for months, Kevin. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep being married to a man who has no ambition, no drive, no future. I'm a lieutenant colonel. I have a career, a trajectory. You're a maintenance worker who can barely make rent." She said, maintenance worker, the way people say, convicted felon, with that particular downward inflection that meant she'd been practicing it in her head for a while, rolling it around like a stone she wanted to throw. I sat at our kitchen table, the one she'd picked out, in the house she'd told me was too small, in the neighborhood she'd complained about since the day we moved in, and I felt something settle inside me. Not grief, not panic. Something quieter and colder than either of those. "You've been talking to Colonel Bryce Harmon," I said. Her jaw tightened. "Just slightly. Just enough. My personal relationships are none of your concern." "Your personal relationships," I repeated slowly. "Right." She straightened. "Sign the papers, Kevin. I'll be fair. You can keep the car. I'll give you 3 months of support payments to get on your feet. Given your situation, I think that's generous." Given your situation. I almost smiled. She had no idea what my situation was. That was, after all, the entire point. I picked up the papers and looked at them for a long moment. My lawyer, not the $20 an hour kind Melissa imagined I could afford, but Thomas Whitfield, one of the best divorce attorneys in the state, who was already on retainer and had been for 6 months, had told me to expect this. He told me to let it happen. Let her file. Let her feel in control. I set the papers back down without signing them. "I need a few days to review these," I said calmly. Melissa blinked. That wasn't the response she'd prepared for. She'd expected tears, maybe, begging, possibly, numb, hollow agreement at the very least. "Kevin, there's nothing to review. It's a straightforward, I'll have my attorney look them over," I said. "I'll be in touch." The word attorney landed in the room like a dropped grenade. Melissa stared at me. "Your attorney." That's what I said. She left 10 minutes later. I heard the front door close behind her, heard her car start, heard it pull out of the driveway. Then I sat alone in the kitchen of that small, complaint-worthy house, in that mediocre neighborhood, in my maintenance worker clothes, and I pulled out my personal phone, not the crack screen budget model I carried around the base, but the one I actually used, and called Thomas. "She filed," I said. "Excellent," Thomas said. "Let's begin. Let me back up. Let me explain how a maintenance worker at Fort Hadley Air Force Base came to own Fort Hadley Air Force Base. My name is Kevin Mercer. I am 38 years old. My father was Richard Mercer, who most people in the defense contracting world knew as the men who built Mercer Strategic Holdings from a 2-person consulting firm into one of the largest private defense infrastructure companies in the country. When he died 6 years ago, he left everything to me, the company, the real estate holdings, the contracts, the investments. The whole thing was worth, at last assessment, somewhere north of $400 million. I had been hiding this from my wife for the entirety of our marriage. That sounds insane. I know it sounds insane. Let me explain. Melissa and I met 8 years ago, when she was a major and I was supposedly just a civilian contractor doing facilities management on the base where she was posted. She was brilliant, commanding, magnetic. She walked into a room and it rearranged itself around her. I fell for her fast and hard, the way you fall for someone who seems to represent everything you want the world to be: ordered, purposeful, certain. We dated for 6 months before she proposed. Yes, she proposed. That should have told me something about how the power was going to flow in this relationship, but I was too far gone to read the signal correctly. I was already, by that point, running Mercer Strategic Holdings through a management structure I'd put in place when my father died. I had a CEO handling day-to-day operations, a board, department heads. I showed up when I needed to, made final calls on major decisions, drew a modest salary that looked unremarkable on paper, and otherwise kept myself invisible. I had reasons for the invisibility. My father had been a man who trusted the wrong people repeatedly because of his wealth. His business partner had stolen from him. 2 of his 3 marriages had ended because his wives had married his money and gradually realized they'd also have to put up with him. He told me, more than once, that the only way to know who really loved you was to remove money from the equation entirely. I took that lesson seriously, maybe too seriously. When I met Melissa, I was between identities in a sense. I'd taken a civilian facilities role on base partly out of genuine interest in understanding the infrastructure world my company was increasingly invested in, and partly because it gave me something to do with my hands, something grounded and real, while the company ran without me needing to steer it every minute. I liked the work. I liked knowing how buildings breathed. When Melissa and I became serious, I made a decision. I would not tell her about the money until I knew, with certainty, that she loved me, Kevin, the man, the person, and not Kevin Mercer, the heir. What I didn't plan for was that Melissa, over time, would come to the conclusion that Kevin the maintenance worker was not enough for her. That she would absorb the values of the officer class so completely that she began measuring people, began measuring me, by rank and salary and trajectory. That she would start coming home with stories about Colonel Bryce Harmon, who was being fast-tracked for general, who had a beautiful house off base, who had investments and connections and a future that matched hers. I noticed the change slowly, then all at once. The way she stopped asking about my day. The way she answered questions about her husband at base social events with a slightly pained expression. The way she began using words like deadweight in conversations about other people, while looking at me with an expression that said she was really talking about us. I hired a private investigator 8 months ago. Not because I needed evidence for a divorce, I had no interest in revenge at that point, but because I needed to know the truth before I decided anything. The investigator, a meticulous former Army counterintelligence officer named Dale Cooper, confirmed what I'd suspected within 3 weeks. Melissa and Colonel Harmon had been meeting privately, first at off-base restaurants, then at his home. The meetings had become something other than professional around 6 months ago. I sat with that information for 2 months. I thought about revealing myself. I thought about confronting her. I thought about simply leaving. What stopped me was something I overheard at a base social event, 3 months before she filed. I was standing near the bar, holding a drink, listening to Melissa talk to a group of other officers and spouses. Someone had asked her, not unkindly, how things were going at home. "It is what it is," Melissa said, with a small, elegant shrug. "Some people have potential and some people have peaked. You can't force someone to be more than they are. Some people," she meant me. She was talking about me to our acquaintances, our social circle, while smiling her polished lieutenant colonel smile. I set my drink down on a tray and went home and called Thomas Whitfield the next morning. And then I waited. The reason I waited was not entirely strategic, though the strategy was sound. I waited because I needed to know how far she would take it. A person who falls out of love and wants out of a marriage is one thing. A person who takes a lover, plans her exit in secret, lines up her next relationship, and then delivers divorce papers like a military operation while standing in dress uniform, that person is something else, and I needed to see it clearly before I did anything about it. She had shown me clearly. I called my mother's cousin Linda that evening, the only family member who knew my full financial situation, and told her the papers had been filed. "How do you feel?" Linda asked. "Ready," I said. The first thing I did was call Fort Hadley's base commander, Major General Craig Ellison. Not through any official channel. Craig and I had known each other for years. He was one of 3 people on the entire installation who knew who I actually was. We'd had dinner twice a year for the last 4 years, always off base, always quiet. "She filed," I said. Craig was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, Kevin, genuinely. I know. Listen, I need to talk to you about the Harmon situation, professionally." Another pause. "What kind of conversation is this going to be? The kind where I tell you that your colonel has been conducting a personal relationship with the wife of a civilian employee on your installation, and where I ask what your regulations say about that?" Craig's voice went carefully neutral. "Do you have documentation?" "I have 6 months of it." I sent the file Dale Cooper had compiled to Craig that night. Not to blow anything up yet, just to put it in the right hands, let the institutional mechanisms know what they were dealing with. What happened next was Craig's call to make. I wasn't interested in getting Harmon court-martialed. I was interested in consequences finding their natural level. The divorce proceedings moved forward. Melissa's attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Holloway, had clearly been briefed on my financial situation, or rather, on what Melissa believed my financial situation to be. The initial filing reflected a man with almost no assets. The settlement offer was condescending in its smallness: the car, 3 months of support, a fraction of our joint savings. Thomas filed our response 2 weeks after the initial filing. It was 47 pages long. I was not present when Patricia Holloway received it. Thomas told me about it afterward. Apparently she read the first 8 pages in his office and then set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone who did not want to show that their hands were shaking. The response included, among other things, documentation of my ownership stake in Mercer Strategic Holdings, current valuation, a list of real estate holdings in my name, including, and this was the part I'd been waiting to reach, the property holding company that held the long-term lease on Fort Hadley Air Force Base's civilian infrastructure. Not the military operations, not the government land, but the buildings, the maintenance contracts, the utilities infrastructure, the housing units for civilian personnel. All of it sat inside a subsidiary of Mercer Strategic Holdings that my father had acquired 22 years ago and that I had retained and expanded. I owned the base where my wife worked. I owned the buildings she walked through every day. I had, without anyone knowing it, been the silent landlord of her entire professional world for the entirety of our marriage. Patricia Holloway reportedly called Melissa immediately. I can only imagine that conversation. I can only imagine Melissa, in her office on base, in her pressed uniform, looking out at the buildings she commanded people in, suddenly understanding that the men she'd dismissed as a maintenance worker, the men she'd written off, talked about behind his back, replaced in her heart with a colonel who owned a nicer house, had been the men whose name was on the lease for the ground under her feet. I received her call 4 hours later. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to the message. Kevin. Her voice was different. All the command had gone out of it. We need to talk. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Please call me back. Please. I did not call her back that day. The legal proceedings that followed were, from my end, almost tedious in their thoroughness. Thomas was a surgeon. He went through every joint account, every asset, every communication I'd had with Melissa over the past 8 months, particularly the ones where she'd discussed my finances with a tone of contempt, and he built a case that was less about winning and more about establishing a complete record of what had actually happened in this marriage. Meanwhile, the base had its own reckoning in progress. Craig Ellison, having reviewed Dale's documentation, had opened a formal inquiry into Colonel Harmon's conduct. The Air Force's policies on fraternization and professional conduct with subordinates' family members were clear and unambiguous. Harmon was not in Melissa's chain of command, technically, but the investigation opened doors that had other things behind them. It turned out Harmon had used his position to secure favorable assignments for at least 2 officers he'd had personal relationships with over the past 3 years. The documentation of his relationship with Melissa was the thread that, once pulled, unraveled a larger pattern. Harmon was relieved of his command 4 months after Melissa filed for divorce. His promotion to brigadier general, which had been described to me by various people at base social events as inevitable, was suspended pending investigation. He hired a defense attorney and began a very different kind of fight than the one he'd probably imagined when he and Melissa started meeting for private dinners. I heard about all of this from Craig, in pieces, over phone calls and quiet dinners. I did not gloat about it. I felt, if anything, a kind of cold satisfaction that had nothing to do with happiness. Harmon had made choices. Choices had consequences. The institutional machinery of the military, once engaged, moved without any help from me. Melissa, meanwhile, was dealing with consequences of her own. The discovery process in our divorce proceedings required her to participate in depositions that were, by all accounts, extremely uncomfortable. Thomas had a gift for asking questions in precisely the sequence that made it hardest to maintain a coherent false narrative. She had to answer, under oath, questions about when she'd begun her relationship with Harmon, about conversations she'd had with him about our marriage, about what she'd known and when. She also had to sit across a conference room table from me. The first deposition was 6 weeks after Thomas's 47-page filing. Melissa walked in looking like she was walking into enemy territory, which she was. She was in civilian clothes, something I noticed, because Melissa almost always defaulted to uniform when she wanted to project authority. The civilian clothes meant she was trying a different strategy. She looked at me when she sat down and something complicated moved through her expression. Kevin, she said. Melissa, I said. That was the entirety of our personal exchange. Thomas and Patricia took it from there. What I noticed, watching Melissa answer Thomas's questions, was that the person I was looking at was not the person I'd married. Or maybe she was, and the person I'd married had always had this inside her, this capacity for calculation, this willingness to discard someone once she'd decided they weren't useful. I'd chosen to see only the magnetic, purposeful woman. I'd romanticized the command presence. I hadn't looked carefully enough at what she did with people she considered beneath her. My father had tried to tell me, once. Watch how she treats the people who can't do anything for her, he'd said, in one of our last conversations before he got sick. That's who she really is. I hadn't listened well enough. The deposition was long. By the end of it, Melissa looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting. Patricia kept having to ask for breaks. During the second break, I stepped out into the hallway and stood by a window looking out at the city, and I felt grief move through me like a slow tide, not for what I was losing, but for what had never actually been there. For the marriage I thought I'd had. For the trust I'd placed in someone who'd been measuring me and finding me insufficient for years before she'd acted on it. I let myself feel it. I wasn't going to perform strength I didn't have. The grief was real, and it deserved acknowledgement. Then the break ended and I went back inside and sat down and let Thomas continue his work. The settlement negotiations were protracted and, at times, almost absurd. Patricia's initial strategy had been to argue that my concealment of my financial situation from Melissa during our marriage was itself a form of bad faith that should be factored into the settlement. Thomas dismantled this argument methodically. I had not hidden money from Melissa in any legal sense. My assets were in my name, disclosed on our tax returns through the company structure, not concealed in any fraudulent way. I had simply not told her how much I was worth. That is not illegal. It is not even unusual. And given that her conduct over the past year had demonstrated precisely the kind of values-based incompatibility my father had warned me about, the decision to withhold that information looked less like deception and more like reasonable caution. Patricia switched strategies. She tried arguing that Melissa's career advancement, her commitment to the military, her professional sacrifices, that these had indirectly benefited my business holdings and should be compensated accordingly. Thomas found this creative but legally insubstantial, and said so in terms that were perfectly polite and utterly devastating. The final settlement was nothing like what Melissa had offered me in our kitchen. It was also, because I am not a vindictive person by nature and had no interest in destroying her financially, not as harsh as it could have been. She received a fair division of our genuinely joint assets, the savings account, the investments we'd made together over 7 years. She received nothing from Mercer Strategic Holdings, which had always been mine. She received no claim on any of the real estate holdings. The house, which was in my name, went back to me. What she walked away with was enough to land on her feet. What she walked away from was considerably more than she'd ever understood she was walking away from. The day the settlement was finalized, I was sitting in Thomas's office when my phone buzzed. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be a new phone Melissa had apparently gotten. The message said, "I know I have no right to ask you anything, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not for the divorce, for how I treated you, for what I said about you. I was wrong about who you were and I was wrong about what mattered and I'm sorry." I read the message twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket. Thomas looked at me across his desk. "Everything all right?" "Yes," I said. "Let's wrap this up." 3 months after the settlement, I moved. Not far. I stayed in the same region, close enough to maintain my involvement with the company's regional interests. But I bought a house that actually reflected my life, not a performance of modesty, not a deliberate understatement, but a home that was simply mine. It had a proper kitchen and a study with good light and a backyard that was large enough to breathe in. I had it decorated by someone with genuine taste. I ordered the furniture I wanted. I stopped performing smallness. It felt strange, at first. I'd maintained the performance for so long that dropping it required a kind of daily intentional effort. I had to relearn how to walk into a room as myself. My assistant, my actual assistant, not the cover story I'd maintained for years, was a sharp, organized woman named Beverly who had worked for my father and then for me for 12 years and who had spent most of those years being quietly exasperated by my insistence on the humble act. On the day I moved into the new house, she sent me a text that said simply, "Finally." I laughed for the first time in months. The company began to come back into full focus. I had kept my hand in it throughout the divorce, major decisions, strategic calls, but I'd been distracted, understandably. Now I turned my attention back properly. We had contracts up for renewal, a potential acquisition in the Northeast, 2 new base infrastructure bids that would require my direct involvement. I flew to 3 cities in 2 weeks and sat in rooms with people who knew exactly who I was and dealt with me accordingly. I'd forgotten, somewhat, what it felt like to be treated as competent by default. It was not that I needed the validation. It was that I'd normalized its absence. Dale Cooper, who had by this point become something like a trusted advisor rather than just a PI, brought me one more piece of information about 6 months after the settlement. Harmon's investigation had concluded. He had accepted a reduction in rank and an administrative discharge rather than face a full court-martial. He had lost his pension above a certain threshold. His attorney had negotiated a settlement with the Air Force that kept the worst of it out of public documentation, but within the base community, which, as anyone who has ever lived near a military installation knows, is a community with almost supernatural information circulation. Everyone knew what had happened and why. Harmon was gone from Fort Hadley. He'd moved to another city, away from the base, away from the career that had defined him. I didn't follow what happened to him after that. I had no reason to. Melissa had been transferred. A voluntary transfer request, according to Craig, submitted 2 months after the divorce finalized. She was now at a base in a different state, a lateral move rather than an advancement. Craig told me, with careful neutrality, that her career trajectory had not been what it once appeared. Whether that was a consequence of the investigation's peripheral attention to her relationship with Harmon, or simply the way careers sometimes go when personal upheaval rearranges priorities, I couldn't say. I held no pleasure in it. The thing about watching someone's life contract is that it doesn't fill the space where something good used to be. It just sits there, factual, inert, neither satisfying nor devastating. Consequences are not the same as justice, exactly. They are just consequences. What I found, in the months after the divorce, was that the work of rebuilding yourself is quieter and more demanding than any revenge. The revenge, if you could even call it that, since I'd done almost nothing except allow truth to exist, had moved quickly, decisively, with the satisfying click of mechanisms engaging. The rebuilding was slower and asked more of me. I went back to therapy. I'd had a therapist before, during my father's illness, and had stopped going when things seemed stable. Now I returned. I talked about my father and his lessons and the ways I'd absorbed them without fully examining them. I talked about why I'd chosen a woman who needed to be managed, who needed the performance of a lesser version of me in order to be in relationship with me. I talked about what that said about what I believed I deserved. It was not comfortable. It was necessary. I took up running again, which I dropped sometime in the 3rd year of marriage because Melissa had made comments about how long it took and how it disrupted her morning schedule. I ran in the mornings now, in the neighborhood around my new house, with no one's schedule to account for but my own. I ran badly at first and then better, and then, by the 4th month, I ran a half marathon without stopping for the first time in my life. I crossed that finish line alone, sweat-soaked and breathing hard, and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Like myself. My cousin Linda visited in the spring, the first spring after everything. She came for a long weekend and cooked elaborate meals and sat with me in the good light study and asked me honest questions and listened to honest answers. She had watched me disappear into that marriage for 7 years, watching the performance become something closer to the truth than the truth had been for a while, and she was relieved in a way she didn't try to hide. Your dad would be proud, she said, on the last morning of her visit. Not of the divorce. Of how you're handling what comes after. I'm still figuring out what comes after, I said. That's what proud looks like, she said. When you're still figuring it out and you're still standing. I met someone, eventually. Not quickly. Not as part of any plan or strategy. It was almost 18 months after the divorce finalized, at a charity event that Mercer Strategic Holdings had co-sponsored, the kind of thing I'd always sent a representative to before, but now attended myself. Her name was Claire. She was a structural engineer who worked with nonprofit organizations on affordable housing infrastructure. She had strong opinions about load-bearing walls and a laugh that reorganized whatever room she was in. I did not tell her about the company on the first date, or the second, or the third, old habits. But on the 4th date, sitting across from her at a restaurant that was genuinely too nice for the conversation we ended up having, she said, "You're doing something. You're editing yourself. What is it?" I looked at her for a long moment. "I have money," I said, more than I usually let on. "I have a complicated history with it." She considered that with the same careful attention she apparently brought to structural problems. "How complicated?" "I'll tell you the whole story if you want it. It's long." "I have time," she said. I told her. All of it. The company, my father's lessons, the marriage, the performance, the divorce, what I'd learned. I talked for almost 2 hours. She listened without interrupting, occasionally asking a precise question when she needed clarification, the way you'd ask about a specific joint in a structure you were trying to understand. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "So you spent 7 years pretending to be someone else," she said. "In a sense. And when she chose not to love that person, you revealed you'd been someone else all along." I thought about that. That's one way to frame it. Is it the right frame? I think the truer frame is that she stopped loving the real person inside the pretense. I think she'd have left me eventually regardless of the money, because I wasn't what she needed in terms of rank and image and social position. The money would have changed the calculation, but it wouldn't have changed what she actually wanted. Claire nodded slowly. "And what do you actually want?" "Something real," I said. "I'm still figuring out the details." She smiled. "I can work with that." We took it slowly. She had her own history, a previous relationship that had ended badly, her own rebuilt trust to tend. We were both people who moved carefully now, who'd learned that rushing toward certainty was its own kind of foolishness. We gave each other room. We showed up consistently. We had the kinds of conversations that build something rather than just describing it. It was different from what I'd had with Melissa in ways that went beyond the surface. With Melissa, I'd always had the sense that I was being audited, that my value was being assessed on a sliding scale of performance. With Claire, I had the sense of simply being present with another person, and that being enough. The simplicity of it took some getting used to. I ran into Melissa once. 14 months after the divorce, at an industry conference I attended under my own name for the first time in years, a defense infrastructure summit where Mercer Strategic Holdings was presenting as a keynote sponsor. She was there in a different capacity, as part of a military advisory panel. I saw her across the reception hall before she saw me. She looked well. Different. There was something quieter about her than I remembered, some of the high-polished certainty worn down into something less bright and more human. She was talking to someone, gesturing with the focused attention she brought to everything, and for a second I could see the woman I'd fallen for 8 years ago, and I understood how I'd made the choices I'd made. She saw me when she turned around, froze for just a moment, then crossed the room. We stood facing each other in the middle of a conference reception, with people moving around us, glasses clinking, the general noise of professional gathering. "Kevin." She looked at my badge. "Kevin Mercer, CEO, Mercer Strategic Holdings. You're the keynote sponsor." "We are, yes." She absorbed that. "I heard about the presentation you gave this morning. People said it was excellent." "Thank you." A silence opened up between us. Not hostile, just wide. "I meant what I said in that message," she said quietly. "I was wrong about you, about what mattered. I was wrong." I looked at her. "She meant it. I could see that she meant it, that this was not manipulation or strategy or a play for something. It was a person acknowledging a truth about themselves, which is one of the harder things humans do. I know, I said. Are you? She hesitated. Are you doing well? I'm doing very well, I said. And then, because it was true and she'd asked honestly, I'm happy, Melissa. I didn't think I'd be saying that this soon, but I am. Something moved through her expression, not bitterness. Something more like grief, and recognition, and a reckoning that had clearly been in process for a while. She nodded once. Good, she said. And then, you deserved better from me. I'm sorry I wasn't it. She walked back to her panel group. I watched her go, and I felt the grief again, that slow tide, that real and honest grief for the marriage that hadn't been what I thought, for the love that had turned out to be conditional on things I'd never agreed to be judged by. I let the grief come and I let it move through me and I did not chase after it or push it away. Then I got a fresh drink and went to find the people I was supposed to talk to about the Northeast acquisition. The keynote presentation the following morning went well. I spoke about the future of civilian infrastructure in military communities, about the ways private investment and public mission could align without one consuming the other. I talked about my father, briefly, about what he'd understood about value and sustainability that the industry had been slow to catch up to. The room was full and attentive in the way rooms get when a speaker has something real to say. Afterward, at the networking lunch, a retired general approached me and said he'd heard I was Richard Mercer's son. I said yes. He said my father had been the best kind of man in the business, the kind who kept his word. I've heard the same about you, he said. Even when you were keeping your word very quietly. I smiled. Quiet was necessary for a while. And now, I thought about the good light study, and the morning runs, and Claire's laugh, and Linda's relief, and Beverly's finally. Now I'm done being quiet, I said. There is something they don't tell you about the life that comes after the version of your life you were hiding inside. They don't tell you how much work it is to inhabit. The money was never the thing I'd been hiding, not really. The money was just the vehicle. What I'd been hiding was myself, my own fullness, my own presence, my own right to take up the space I actually occupied. I'd performed smallness so completely and for so long that it had started to feel like truth. The marriage to Melissa had accelerated that process. Every time she'd made her comments, about ambition, about trajectory, about men who'd peaked, I'd absorbed it without revealing the lie. But absorbing it had done something, slowly, quietly. It had made me wonder if maybe she was right. Not about the money. About some essential quality. About whether I was the kind of person who deserved to be seen. That is the most insidious thing about being underestimated by someone who is supposed to love you. It starts to colonize your own estimation of yourself. Coming out the other side of it, the divorce, the revelation, the rebuilding, was not a triumphant moment. It was a series of small, honest moments strung together across months. Running badly and then better. Sitting in the therapist's office saying hard things. Calling Linda at 11 o'clock at night when the house was too quiet. Learning to eat dinner alone without it feeling like failure. Learning, eventually, to eat dinner with Claire without performing anything at all. I ran that half marathon on a Tuesday morning in October, 14 months after Melissa filed for divorce. I crossed the finish line alone and stood there with my hands on my knees, catching my breath, feeling the cold air in my lungs, watching other runners pass me and not caring at all about their pace or position. Beverly had driven me to the race and was waiting at the finish. She handed me a water bottle and looked at me with the expression of someone who had watched a very long and unnecessary delay finally come to an end. Took you long enough, she said. Everything does, I said. The Mercer Strategic Holdings annual report that year showed our strongest performance in 11 years. The Northeast acquisition went through smoothly. 2 of the base infrastructure bids were awarded to us, including, with appropriate professional distance managed through an independent review process, a significant contract renewal at Fort Hadley. I signed that contract in my actual office, at my actual desk, as myself, and I thought of the morning Melissa had slid those papers across the kitchen table with all the certainty of someone who had already won. She had not won, but I had not lost in the way she'd intended. What had actually happened was something more interesting and more complicated. A truth that had been held underwater for years had finally been allowed to surface, and in surfacing it had changed the shape of everything. I was not the maintenance worker. I had never been only the maintenance worker, but I was also not simply the CEO, the heir, the man with 400 million in holdings. I was the person who had watched his marriage dissolve with grief and steadiness, who had chosen not to perform smallness anymore, who had run a half marathon on a Tuesday and stood breathing cold air at the finish line with no one watching and felt, for the first time in years, completely himself. That is who I am. That is the truth Melissa never got to know. I heard, through the loose network of people who follow such things, that she made full colonel. Good. She was brilliant and capable and she deserved the rank she'd worked for. Whatever she'd done wrong in our marriage didn't cancel the 30 years of service. I hoped the transfer had given her some distance from the Fort Hadley chapter, some room to reconsider the values she'd been performing as much as I'd been performing modesty. I didn't check. I had my own life to attend to. The house with the good light and the proper kitchen and the breathing backyard became, over the course of a year, something that felt like home in the way our married house never had. Claire stayed over more and more often. We didn't rush it. We moved at the speed of people who understood that the building is the thing, not the image of the building. One evening in late spring, sitting on the back porch with the light going gold over the yard, Claire looked at me and said, "Are you happy?" I thought about it honestly. The way she'd taught me, she expected honesty. "Yes," I said, genuinely. She nodded, satisfied with the answer, the way you're satisfied when a structure's load-bearing calculation comes back clean. "Good," she said. The world was quieter now. More honest. More mine. I had faked being poor and it had cost me a marriage I'd needed to lose. I had owned the base my wife walked through every day and never told her, and she had never asked because she'd already decided who I was. I had signed nothing on the morning she filed, and that refusal, small, quiet, the first honest assertion of myself in years, had been the beginning of everything that came after. I don't think about Melissa often anymore. When I do, it's without the sharp edges. The grief has smoothed into something that's almost understanding, for her, for me, for the two people we were who were wrong for each other in ways that ran deeper than money or rank. What I think about, instead, is the running, the morning air, the conversations with Claire that go on past midnight because neither of us wants to stop, Beverly's exasperated fondness, Linda's relief, the Northeast acquisition, the good light in the study where I sit now, writing this, not for anyone else but because I want to understand my own story clearly. My father used to say that the truth doesn't need defending, it only needs time. He was right. He was usually right. The divorce papers that Melissa slid across the table that morning were the beginning of my honest life. I should probably thank her for that. I won't, but I could.